Okay, I lived in Seattle for 35 years and spent a lot of time on the Olympic Peninsula um, coming from Seattle. So I feel like I know at least some of the plants here. But I'm not alone in putting this presentation together because really these are slides that were taken by 10 members of our chapter, and we started out arranging a slideshow. Kathy Darrow, our vice chair, put together a slideshow for the beginning of our evening programs in the fall last year. And therefore, I had a whole bunch of slides to work with. So thank you to everybody. And you'll see those people's names on the slides and at the end of the program. Oh, technical glitch. Let's see. There it is. So we're going to start with a map made by David Peter, who is a Forest Service botanist who I think lives in the peninsula. I see him a lot. And I want to show you where we are in this peninsula. Most people know where the Olympic Peninsula is, but I'll point out a few landmarks on it. So you should be able to see my cursor moving. So here's where I live. This little piece of land sticking out here is called the Quimper Peninsula. And Port Townsend is right up there. And this is Discovery Bay. And I actually live on the east side of Discovery Bay. In the middle of the peninsula is, of course, the Olympic Mountains. That's where Olympic National Park, most of it is. And on the west side, the Pacific Ocean. So we have a lot of cool, moist air coming in from the ocean and blocked by the Olympic Mountains, creating a rain shadow that runs from Squim, which is right about here. You can see Dungeness Spit sticking out, and includes the whole area around Discovery Bay and Port Townsend and east of Port Townsend. And this is all parts of Jefferson County, and Squim is Clallam County. So we have rainforest on the coast. We have some prairies, although many of them have been destroyed in the drier areas. We have subalpine and alpine habitat in the Olympic Mountains. We have rain shadow forests on the dry northeastern side of the peninsula. We have wetlands and estuaries scattered throughout wet areas, mostly on the three sides of the peninsula that have water, and we have coastal beaches. And my original intent with this slideshow was to focus on the prairies, the rain shadow forests, and the subalpine. And so those will be the ones you'll see the largest number of slides, and then a smaller number of slides for the other habitats. So we're going to start with the Olympic rainforest, and I tried to put in the name of a trail or two or a location or two where you could actually go once you're able to go to places and take a hike or see the plants that we're talking about. And if you go to the Hoh area of the Olympic National Park, which is on the west coast of the Olympic Peninsula, you can find the Hoh River Trail, which is a beautiful rainforest trail, as you can see in this fall picture by Ann Weinman. On this trail, in the Hoh Rainforest, there are some trees that are especially important. One is the bigleaf maple, which you probably are familiar with if you live on the west side of Washington at all. And you can see in this picture not only maples, but a lot of mosses on the trees and ferns underneath. And this is a typical forest that's actually a little drier than the wettest of the rainforest. And we also find our dominant conifer tree, Sitka spruce. Sitka spruce is a conifer that needs to live in a moist environment because the stomates on the leaves don't close. And you find Sitka spruce up and down the Pacific coast of Washington and British Columbia and Alaska, but you also find it in the Hoh rainforest and all the Pacific coast rainforest. And you can see that Sitka spruce is a really important habitat tree for other plants and animals to live on, whether it's alive or whether it's dead. And it still provides a place for organisms to live, or even nutrients for the organisms to live on. And then I'm going to show you just a few plants that you might find in the rainforest. And these are common in many Western Washington moist forests. So the oval leaf huckleberry, and we have a number of plants in the rhododendron family, including the huckleberries throughout Washington. And this is obviously an edible plant. We have a composite that we know as the Western rattlesnake root, and composites are daisy type plants. If you look carefully at these flowers, this is actually many flowers. Each one of these bifurcated pointy things is the styles, the two female parts of this flower. And you can see that there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 flowers in this cluster that we think of as one flower, and that makes it a composite flower. And one last photo from the rainforest is the green false hellebore, Veratrum viridi. And Veratrum is one of the plants that used to be called a lily, used to be in the lily family. And one of the things that you're going to notice as we go through here is that there's a couple of families that, with the new edition of the Flora of the Pacific Northwest that came out in 2018, the families have been split up into a number of different families, and one of them is the lily family. So this plant, which normally would be vertical, the stem would be vertical, but for some reason in this picture it was hanging over, maybe from weight. This plant is in a family called the Melanthaceae, which I'm sure you don't even need to know. And it is a toxic plant, a poisonous plant if you were to eat it, but very beautiful. Okay, so that's a very short taste of the rainforest. I'm going to spend a lot more time in the next 3 areas. We're going to start with the prairies. Up here in Port Townsend, where I live, we are very fortunate to have a remnant of a native prairie. And we call it the Katai Prairie. And one of our chapter members, Dixie Llewellyn, has been instrumental in maintaining and originally finding this piece of prairie and organizing work parties to keep it maintained, keep it free of weeds. It is actually at the golf course, or at least at the parking lot of the golf course, right in the city of Port Townsend. It's 1.4 acres, and it has been preserved and maintained since 1987 by members of the Washington Native Plant Society and the city of Port Townsend. We have identified 90 species of plants in there, not all natives, including 27 prairie indicator species that says that this is a true native prairie. And there are not very many other pieces of prairie left because prairie areas became agricultural areas and became towns. So in this picture, we're going to see all these plants in a minute, but you can see the common camas, very common plant in the springtime. So one of the first flowers that is apparent, that comes out and blooms on the Katai or any prairie in this area are the grass widows. They used to be called Sisyrinchium. Now the genus has been changed to Ulcinium. These are members of the iris family, and if you look at them, they look a little like a little tiny iris. Notice the leaves, very long and narrow. And here is the common camas. Common camas can be found in prairies throughout Western Washington and south, very common in the area around Olympia and Fort Lewis McChord. These These plants, again, used to be in the lily family, and now they're in the asparagus family. They have an edible bulb, and the Native Americans who lived in the areas where camas grew actually encouraged these plants to grow by burning the fields and keeping the larger shrubbier plants from growing there so that they could come back each spring and harvest the bulbs before the camas bloomed. So today we see huge areas in some places of blue camas right around May or June. And these are what we see today, the legacy of the Native Americans that harvested these bulbs. And here's a picture of the camas in the background and a little rose family plant called prairie smoke, this reddish plant, plus you can see some buttercups there. Here's another plant that you can find in the prairie, field chickweed, related to the weedy chickweeds that we have, but this one is a native. It's in the pink family. And a common characteristic of the pink family is that there are 5 petals, but they often have notches in them. So you can see this really clearly in this picture. If you don't look too carefully, you think there's 10 petals of this flower, but it's actually only 5 with these beautiful notches. And here's our native Western buttercup. Buttercup in the buttercup family. And usually a characteristic of that family is a lot of stamens. And you can see all the many stamens in the middle of this flower. And then the next 2 slides are 2 different plants in the saxifrage family. So again, we have notched petals in this prairie star. In this case, there's 3 lobes on each petal, so still only 5 petals, but from a distance, it looks like a lot more. And the other thing that botanists might recognize in the saxifrage family is that you see kind of an opening right here in the middle, but you don't see the stamens and carpels, the male and female parts. And I'm going to show you the next picture because it shows you a little more clearly. Here's another saxifrage, the prairie saxifrage. And both of these plants have a structure called a floral cup or a hypanthium that attaches to all the petals and sepals and pulls the middle part, the sexual parts of the flower down. In this one, there's a lot of nectar glands there. The other thing you can notice about the saxifrage family is, not so much in that one, is that the sepals are often larger than the petals. So in this prairie saxifrage, these big white things are the sepals, and in between them are the petals. I may be wrong. I think that's right. You're going to see some more later. And another lily. This one is a true lily, and this is the chocolate lily, beloved by many people who go to the meadows and look for them because they're not quite as common as the camas or the chickweed. And here's the former lily that's close to my heart. It's called death camas. My graduate research was about this plant and other plants in its former genus. So formerly this was in the genus Zygodinus, and with the new addition of the flora, it went back to an old name, Toxicoscordion, which comes from the, I want to say, early 1800s, I think. And I wasn't involved in the DNA research to determine why they went back to the old name, but they did, and they put this death camas that lives in the prairies in a different genus than the one that lives in the mountains that you'll see a little bit later. Death camas, by the way, is poisonous to especially to livestock like sheep. you probably wouldn't kill a person to eat it, but it would definitely make you sick. And if you were harvesting bulbs for camas, the leaves before the flowers come out look almost the same as the death camas. So hence its name. Here is a little larkspur, prairie larkspur that grows in our native prairie. And this is in the buttercup family. And you may notice it doesn't look anything like a buttercup. But if you remember, I said that the buttercups usually have many stamens, lots and lots of stamens. And you can't see it in this flower because the petals cover it up. But underneath those petals are many stamens. We have a native rose that grows in the prairie, and this only in certain areas of the prairie that become a little bit shrubby, and this is the Nootka rose. And a couple of species of desert parsleys. This one is called spring gold, and these are in the parsley family. This is a beautiful yellow flower that comes out early in the spring. And here's another desert parsley that comes a little bit later called the pestle parsnip. And I can only assume, I don't know exactly why it's called pestle parsnip, but I think it has to do with grinding the root in a mortar and pestle to be eaten. We also have in the prairie a couple of species that are not totally able to live on their own. In other words, they're partial parasite. Well, this one is a partial parasite. The next one you're going to see is a total parasite. And when we say parasites in plants, what we mean is that the plant is not making much food on its own. And the total parasites don't have any leaves at all. This one does have some leaves, the dwarf owl clover. But it has a connection underground with a fungus, and the fungus will connect into another plant, a green plant, and it will pull, fungus will pull some nutrients from the green plant, and then this parasite, the partial parasite, will take some nutrients through the fungus. So we sometimes call these plants mycoheterotrophs, or in this case, a partial mycoheterotroph, which means fungus eating, or is able to eat via a fungus. And here's the total mycoheterotroph, total parasite, purple broom rape. And this plant has absolutely no leaves. And you look for it in the meadow and you'll see these beautiful purple flowers about 3-4 inches high. And they're just coming straight out of the ground. So these are always very exciting to find. And a couple more composite or daisy type flowers, the woolly sunflower, common in our prairie, and a little later in the season, the showy fleabane, which is more of a purple colored daisy. And you can see this is later summer because of all the brown grass around it. And another late summer plant that's really a splash of color in the prairie is the harvest brodea. And this particular picture wasn't taken at the Port Townsend Katai Prairie, but Anderson Lake State Park is only maybe less than 10 miles away. So it's pretty close. So that was an array of plants from the prairies. Now, many of you that have come to the Olympic Peninsula before probably have gone up to Hurricane Ridge or somewhere like that in Olympic National Park. And depending on how high the elevation is, you can be in the subalpine or the alpine. I'm going to be showing you pictures from the subalpine. Here's a typical meadow of a subalpine. So subalpine zone means that there are some trees. It's not totally missing trees as the alpine is, but there's a lot of meadow. And remember that the weather conditions, the climate conditions in the subalpine and the alpine are very harsh. There's a really short growing season that probably lasts from the end of July till sometime in September. And that's all the plants that flower really have to do their flowering then, because the rest of the time it's under snow. And I wrote up here, see this, you can see this ecosystem or this habitat at Hurricane Ridge, which is accessed through Port Angeles, through the ranger station of the Olympic National Park at Port Angeles, and Mount Townsend, which is accessed via Quilcene, which is southeast part of the peninsula. So the dominant tree in the subalpine is the Pacific silver fir. And Pacific silver fir is one of my favorite conifers because it's just beautiful. It's got needles that are bushy on 3 sides of the branch and dark green colored, especially as they're older in the season, on the top. But if you turn the branch over, the bottom of the needles are very, very light because that's where all the stomates for gas exchange exist. And there's a real big color contrast. And another tree that grows along with the Pacific silver fir is the mountain hemlock. So if you live in Western Washington or many other places, you are probably familiar with the Western hemlock. This is the same genus, but a different species. And you can tell them apart when you get close to them because, well, several reasons, but one is the Western hemlock has needles that are both long and short on the same branch. Mountain hemlock, all the needles are pretty much the same length. Also, they are bushy, the needles are bushier around the branch, so you don't just have a flat 2 layers of needles like you do in mountain hemlock. And from a distance, the mountain hemlock is a pretty straight tree at the top, whereas the Western hemlock has what we call a drooping leader where the top hangs over. So, plus, of course, you would see these in the mountains, usually over about 3,000 feet. And beneath the trees, you would find smaller shrubs in the subalpine, like the red mountain heather. And you may remember the huckleberry that I mentioned earlier. So these are in the same family. Heathers and huckleberries are in the rhododendron family, and the rhododendron obviously is in the same family. And many of them live in Washington. They tend to like more acidic soils. Here's another rhododendron family, the white flower rhododendron. And another characteristic of this family is that the petals are all fused together. So you can really see it back here with the red mountain heather, that this is like a cup, and that's actually 5 petals. This is also true in this white flowered rhododendron. There's just a little bit more lobing to these flowers. And this one, the white flowered rhododendron, is a shrub that can get to be 6 or 8 feet tall, whereas the mountain heather is much shorter than that. Here's a landscape picture showing small flowered paintbrush at Lillian Ridge. And Lillian Ridge is a ridge near Hurricane Ridge. You drive up to the Hurricane Ridge parking lot and then out a road called Obstruction Point Road. And that will take you to a parking lot where you can access Lillian Ridge. Early in the spring in the subalpine, you can find fields of these avalanche lilies. And they're just some of the first flowers that come out. And this is a great photograph because it shows the water droplets on it. The next picture is another flower that comes out very early, the Western pasque flower in the buttercup family. So this is actually a type of anemone. And some of these have really beautiful blue veins on the back of these are actually sepals, not petals. And later in the season, I don't have a picture of it here, but the seeds have these long hairs that come from them, and they always look like little mini mops lining the meadow. Some of the plants that grow under other shrubs in the subalpine that you can see in the summer are showy Jacob's ladder. And this is in the phlox family. It's a beautiful native. Sitka valerian, and you've probably heard of valerian if you haven't seen it, because valerians have compounds in them that are used to induce sleep for people that are need help sleeping. And we have several species of native onions, including this one, the nodding onion. You can see how the stem bends over so that when it flowers, the flowers are actually facing down. And the bleeding heart, Pacific bleeding heart, which is just one of my favorite flowers, it's probably not exactly in the subalpine. It's on the little bit lower elevation than the subalpine. But if you are familiar with looking for petals and sepals in flowers, try it on this one sometime. It's kind of interesting. These are sepals that you see, and if you can't really see the petals very well here, but they're in the middle between the sepals. Right, here you can see it on this one. There are many penstemons that grow in the subalpine, and this is just one, Davidson's penstemon, which is a very low growing shrub with flowers that look like they're way too big for the leaves. And by the way, the penstemons used to be in the family Scrophulariaceae, the figwort family or snapdragon family. And one of the changes in the new flora that we have is that family essentially doesn't really exist anymore. It's broken up into a number of different families. So this one is in the Plantago family now. And here is another death camas, mountain death camas, Anticlea elegans, used to be Zygodinus elegans, but it is considered different enough, and I assume this has to do with DNA analysis. It's different enough from the prairie's death camas that I showed you earlier to put it in a different genus. And this is just a gorgeous flower that you can find in the higher elevations in the Olympic Mountains. And by the way, these little greenish things on the flower are nectar glands, and that's the word Zygodinus. The old name of this flower means twin yolks, yolk glands that are in like a yoke of oxen, and that's what these are. They're little glands on each petal. And this is everybody's favorite, the elephant heads. So the elephant heads is a type of lousewort. There are a number of species of lousewort in the higher elevations of the Olympic Mountains and the Cascade Mountains. And this one just looks like elephants. You can see the little trunk and the head and the ears. So this is also a partial parasite. It used to be in that figwort family that got broken up, and now it's in the same family as the broomrape that I showed you, the total parasite that I showed you earlier from the prairie. And that's the Orobanchaceae, the Orobanchae family. Here is another really interesting plant. I apologize, it's my picture, so I can apologize for it not being in great focus, but this is the common butterwort. And the butterwort grows in wet places along streams. So as the water runs over a little muddy bank or something of a stream, you'll find butterwort. Butterworts have sticky leaves, and they capture insects on their sticky leaves. They digest the protein out of the insects and and absorb it in through their leaves to help them with their nutrients. So we're lucky to have butterworts on our trails, and I've seen them in the Cascades as well as the Olympic Mountains. I'm going to stop for questions soon. I see questions are coming in. Here is a Columbia tiger lily, and the Columbia tiger lilies are stunning lilies. They are still in the lily family. They grow to be 3 or 4 feet tall, and they have these brilliant orange or yellow orange colors with huge stamens that you can see hanging down, and probably 10 or 12 flowers on each plant. So they're quite stunning, and one of my favorites. And this is a grass. There are not a lot of grasses. Most plants that we think are grasses in the subalpine of this area are actually sedges or rushes, but this one is a true grass, the alpine timothy, captured in a beautiful photo. And what you're seeing there is stamens, male parts of the flowers hanging out of the inflorescence. We have a few plants in the Olympics that we're always looking for because they're special. They live here. They're either endemic or partially are endemic to this area or just to the Olympics. And this is Piper's harebell, which is endemic to the Olympic Mountains, Vancouver Island, and parts of British Columbia. And you can't find it anywhere else. And this is a beautiful picture that Kathy Darrow took because it shows not only the harebell growing in the rocks, but the lichens on the rock that give those color contrasts. And here's another harebell that grows a little lower elevation, the Schuyler's harebell with white flowers. Another beautiful photo. Olympic Mountain aster is also in the same kind of range where you would find the Piper's harebell. So the Olympic Mountains, Vancouver Island, and parts of British Columbia. And this one, Flet's fleabane, is only found in the Olympic Mountains. So that's a true endemic of the Olympic Mountains, usually on high rocky cliffs. And back to the saxifrages. There are many saxifrages in the Pacific Northwest, so I only have a couple of pictures here. This is a spotted saxifrage, and remember that often the sepals are larger and showier than the petals, so these spotted things are the sepals, and the petals are, well, okay, I was going to say these are petals, but I think they're stamens. So we're going to leave that for a second. I'll show you the next one. There it is. This one on the grass of Parnassus. Again, we have, I think we have showy sepals here too, and I could be wrong. This is a beautiful fringy one. Okay, I'm going to show you the rain shadow forest, and then the other two, we just have a few slides because I want to leave time for questions. So here's the Olympic Mountains. The moist air comes this way, it gets stopped at the Olympic Mountains, and we have rain shadow. In Sequim and Port Townsend, we have about, Sequim has 15 inches of rain a year, and Port Townsend has 17 inches of rain a year. The rainfall in Seattle, which is over here, is, I believe, 38 inches a year. I wrote this down somewhere. So Seattle has about 38 inches a year. Forks over here has about 110 inches of rainfall a year. So you can see that these areas of Sequim to Port Townsend and down on the Quimper Peninsula are very dry compared to most of, certainly all of the peninsula and most of Western Washington. And in the dry areas of these forests, we do have the trees that you would see in a typical Puget Sound forest, like Western hemlock and Western red cedar and Douglas fir. So I'm not going to show you pictures of those, but I am going to show you some pictures of trees and plants that are more specific to the rainforest, rain shadow forest. And this is one, the Pacific madrone. Pacific madrone has been having trouble in urban areas, but it's doing pretty well out on the peninsula. And we are lucky in Port Townsend to be close to 2 state parks, actually 3 state parks, but Fort Worden, which is right in the city of Port Townsend, and Fort Townsend, which is just like 3 miles south of Port Townsend, both have rain shadow forests. And besides the Pacific madrone, another tree that is common here that you don't necessarily see in wetter areas is a grand fir. This particular grand fir on the left, I think, was taken in Anacortes, but the one on the right was taken right here at Port Townsend, Quimper Wildlife Corridor, owned by the Jefferson Land Trust. And it is similar to the silver fir in that the needles are dark on the top and light colored if you turn them over, but not nearly as bushy on the branch. And one of the plants that we have a lot of here and should be blooming in about a month is the Pacific rhododendron, our Washington state flower. And they just are everywhere, along the roads, in the parks, and in the forest hiking areas. We have huckleberries, such as this red huckleberry, which is one of the deciduous huckleberries. So you can see in the middle of the winter, there's no leaves on it, but there are certainly the red fruits. And the rose that I showed you before, the Nootka rose, but also another rose called the bald hip rose. Roses make their fruits inside these red structures, which are actually swollen sepal. Well, the sepals are on it, the swollen ovaries. And so these are called hips. And if these little things are the sepals, if they stay on it, then the hip is not bald, right? In the bald hip rose, those sepals are gone. They fall off as the fruit matures, and we have a bald hip rose. So that's one way you can tell them apart. Their spines are different also. Many of you from Western Washington will be familiar with the Devil's Club, Oploponix horridus. You can see these spines on the leaves, but the spines go all the way up and down the stem. This is a plant that's 5 or 6 or more feet high with a very straight, narrow stem full of spines. But if you can remove the spines, which Native Americans did, it's actually very strong, straight wood that they would use for digging sticks. And some little understory plants in the rain shadow forest. This is coltsfoot, beautiful composite flower that's blooming right about now. Vanilla leaf, which is a relative of Oregon grape, same family as Oregon grape. And this is a ground cover with large leaves and very, very tiny white flowers in this little cluster. This is the bunchberry, which is actually a tiny dogwood. Bunchberry is maybe 6 inches tall off the ground, but it is in the dogwood family. In fact, it's in the same genus as the dogwood. And this is many flowers. Each one of those little dark things is a separate flower surrounded by, in this case, 4 bracts. Another ground cover is the dwarf bramble, which is kind of like a miniature raspberry. It's just got a couple leaves and a little flower or two that make a a raspberry with about 4 little drupelets on it, and it can cover large areas of the ground. And we have several ferns, one of which I just had to put this picture in because it's so beautiful. This is a sword fern, which many of you are familiar with, but when ferns first unfurl the leaves, they're always coiled like this, and you can see the coiling. And it will lose that as it opens up. And another fern that's really one of my favorites is the licorice fern. And this is a great picture because you can see the spores, the spore packets on the back of the fern. Licorice fern grows, it does not like to grow in the ground. It's too wet. So it needs to be on a dry place like a branch where the rhizome can sit on the branch underneath this moss. And then when it's wet, the leaves come out, and in the middle of summer, the leaves dry up and you don't see it. Orchids, excuse me. This is our favorite little Calypso orchid. It's blooming right now where I live, right near Discovery Bay and probably many other places. It's about 3-4 inches high, and has 2 little leaves, 1 or 2 little leaves at the bottom, and this beautiful orchid flower. And in the rain shadow forest, especially in Fort Townsend State Park, for some reason, we have many species of parasitic plants. Remember, they are actually mycoheterotrophs. They get their nutrients through fungus that's attached to another plant, but they have no green leaves. This one, the ground cone, is in that same family as the broom rape. So it's in the Orobanchaceae. And the rest that I'm going to show you are in the rhododendron family, the Ericaceae. Here's one called the gnome plant. And what you're seeing on these plants is just the flowers, because having no leaves, it doesn't need to have any of the rest of itself above ground, just the flowering part in order to reproduce and be pollinated. Here is pine sap. And these are quite stunning when you're walking on a trail and everything looks brown on the ground, and all of a sudden you see a cluster of pine sap or pine drops, which this is also common in eastern Washington. And you can see these look like little huckleberry flowers, but they're not. And this one is called candy stripe, and as it gets larger, you'll see it's got red and white stripes through it, and this part will have many flowers. All right, we're going to just have a couple more short journeys into ecosystems here. One is the wetlands and estuaries, and then we'll see the coastal beaches. So we have water on the peninsula on the west side, the Pacific Ocean on the north side, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and on the east side, Puget Sound. So there's lots of places where water meets the land, and lots of areas that are called wetlands. Wetlands are defined as areas that are wet at least part of the year, that retain that moisture at least part of the year, and sometimes more than part of the year. So I picked 2 examples, actually 3, because you can look at this picture. Gibbs Lake and Indian Island are both on the east side of the peninsula in Jefferson County, and Cape Alava is on the west side of the peninsula, right near the northwest corner of the state. And right in the middle of Port Townsend and Fort Worden State Park, we have a wetland that has salt water, and a plant that's common there is pickleweed, Salicornia perennis. These are called the Chinese gardens because at one time, when this was a military fort, Chinese immigrants were, or Chinese workers were kind of drafted into building part of the fort there, and they camped and had a vegetable garden in the area. Well, it's not there anymore, but it's still called the Chinese gardens. And there's a big lagoon there surrounded by, part of it by pickleweed. Pickleweed's in the mustard family. It's salty and it really tastes a little like pickles, quite edible. Plants that grow in wetlands often can grow in acidic conditions. And here's the bog laurel, western bog laurel at Gibbs Lake County Park. And a bog is basically an acidic wetland. And this is in the rhododendron family. Another plant that grows there is the tufted yellow loosestrife. So you may be familiar with purple loosestrife and say, oh no, that's a bad plant. That's an invasive weed in many places, but this is actually one of our native loosestrifes. And it's much smaller and less aggressive than the purple loosestrife, and it's quite beautiful. And of course, you can't be in a wetland in Washington and not think about skunk cabbage, which is our only native plant in the arum family. So you may know arums from the East Coast, like Jack in the Pulpit, or from Hawaii, like anthuriums, and many houseplants are arums. But this is our only native, and it's quite a stunning plant. We also actually have cranberries, bog cranberries, right in Jefferson County in our Gibbs Lake County Park, where there is a bog. And fleshy Jaumea, Daybob Bay is south of Port Townsend towards Quilcene. And these are plants that retain water, because remember, even though they're growing in water, if they're growing in salt water, they really can't get that much water, so they can retain fresh water in their leaves and sometimes salty water in their leaves. And from Cape Alava on the west side of the peninsula, we have a swamp gentian and a king's gentian. Gentians are always favorites of mine because they stand out so beautifully. Finally, a few pictures from the coastal beaches. And again, these could be any of these coasts. So right here at Fort Worden, we are, the Native Plant Society is working to protect this plant. This is the yellow sand verbena. Rat Island is not far from here. It's near Fort Flagler State Park, maybe 10 miles south of Port Townsend. And I was out at Fort Worden working last summer to cordon off areas where this plant was growing so that people would not walk on top of it. And we have a lot of sand verbena coming back into the beaches there. Also on the sandy beaches, we have beach pea vine, a sweet pea relative. And blue-eyed Mary, which grows in many different habitats around the state, but I've certainly seen it on the beach. I've seen it in Anacortes on the Rocky Balds. I've seen it in Eastern Washington. And this is a little plant that used to be in the figwort family. And so it's a relative of snapdragons. And I believe this is the last picture here, the beach carrot. And this is a plant in the carrot or parsley family that grows right in the sand on Point Wilson Beach, Fort Worden State Park. Oh, not quite the last one. Sea blush. Had to put this in because one of my favorites also, you can see meadows, looks like meadows of this plant growing along the water. Callow Point is a private housing development just south of Port Townsend. So you have to have permission or know somebody that lives there to get in there. But they have a beautiful beach, and there's a picture of the Callow Point beach with sea blush and field chickweed. So I have to say, I'm not used to talking that long without answering questions. So we'll see how this goes. But I did want to, before we take questions, say that I use these two references a lot in preparing this. The Burke Image Collection and the new second edition of the Flora of the Pacific Northwest. And there are a lot of disagreements about names, but these two, both run by the University of Washington, seem to be in agreement with the latest naming. And finally, I would like to thank the photographers who are all members of the Washington Native Plant Society Olympic Chapter, and many other people in that chapter too that have done things to keep native plants growing in our area. And at the bottom, you can see that we do have a website attached to the State Native Plant Society website. So feel free to take a look at our website, and when we start hiking again, come and join us. All right, Denise.
Thank you, Fayla. That was beautiful. We have lots of questions. Very
Okay.
exciting. So we'll start. Let's go first with the chat.
Okay.
And Caitlin Marist says thank you. And Jennifer Riker says thank you. And
Great.
Amy Myers says wonderfully done. Thanks to everyone involved. Any way we can get this PowerPoint. And I can answer that question. Recordings will be coming later, provided that we get release from all these fabulous photographers. So stay tuned on the presentations coming forward. And then Marilee Morgan says, Blue-Eyed Mary is flowering right now here in the Eastern Cascades.
Yes, it is.
And there is some sand verbena in Haynesville, as reported by Grace. And Sue Butkus wonders if I'm out in my yard, and actually no, I'm on a trail in the Bogoshiel because it's the Olympic National Park. Thank you, Sue. And then we have questions here for you.
Okay.
So Caitlin asks, I missed where we could find the beach carrot. Do you mind repeating that?
Oh, I think that picture is from Fort Worden State Park. Let me see. Yes. So there's a lighthouse at Fort Worden called, and it's the area where the lighthouse is called Point Wilson, and this grows all along that beach. And I'm guessing a lot of other beaches too.
Very good. And another one, could you please pronounce the Latin names as well?
Well, I thought about that before I started speaking, and I thought it would take too long, but I would be happy to help you with any particular one that you're interested in.
And there's Sarah Rodriguez asks how the plants receive their names. So perhaps she's referring to the naming changes in the naming conventions.
How are they breaking up into other plant families? This has to do with DNA research. So the first edition of the Hitchcock Flora was published in 1973, I think. And now it's, this one came out in 2018. And between those 2 years, especially from the mid-1980s on, a lot of DNA research happened. And people started sequencing the DNA of this genus and that genus and the other one, and they looked at how different the DNA was. And if the DNA is considerably different, they say, well, these don't belong together. They're not related to each other. And I think that's kind of the basis of how all these changes came about.
And Katie Lutz, any surprising finds on any of your most recent trips? And thank you for the excellent presentation.
Oh, I wish I had most recent trips. I, of course, haven't been able to go very far in the last couple of months. Um, I don't know if I can find anything, if I can think of anything right now, but I love going up to the Subalpine. That's just always my favorite each year. And there, of course, are many plants that I didn't have photos of. Um, there's a pea family plant called Hedysarum that grows up in the Olympics that's gorgeous, that I hadn't been aware of before I moved here. So I'll say that one. It's a bright pink pea that kind of like a vetch that grows all over in certain areas.
And are bog cranberries edible?
I believe so. So it's basically a huckleberry. So if you can eat a huckleberry, you can eat that.
I believe there's a forage that the Kopsiopsis chapter does right before Thanksgiving every year to gather cranberries. And we had one other question from Jess Jones. Are there any other orchid species in the Olympics?
Oh, many. There are several species of the coral root orchid, which I didn't put in this, and I should have, but that would be found in the rain shadow forest. So we have the coral root orchid, I think 3 or 4 species. We have the lady's tresses, Romanzophia. We have the calypso orchid, little tiny orchid called twayblade, listera, and we have all the bog orchids, or rain as in REIN orchids, that have their Platanthera and Listera and a couple of other genera now. They've changed the names. So there are quite a few.
Very good.
Okay, I
let's
see.
Grace H., should we actually meet in person? Where are the Olympic Peninsula meetings generally held?
They are in Port Townsend at the Port Townsend Community Center, and it's the second or third Tuesday of each month, but they're only from October until May. So they're gone for this year. And then we'll start up again in October of next year, or October of 2020. It's when we can't get outside that we meet inside.
And Regina Johnson asks, are all parasitic plants now mycoheterotrophs?
I believe that is true. Yeah, and I noticed, the reason I use the word parasite is the Flora of the Pacific Northwest uses parasite, either hemiparasite or holoparasite. So I figured, okay, they're using that term, but my understanding is they're really mycoheterotrophs. They're not just directly taking nutrients from the host. They're doing it through the fungus. I see also that Sarah Rodriguez had a follow-up by the names. I mean, how they are called beach carrot or sword fern. Those are common names, and common names are what people around the area call these plants. And if you look in either on the website, the FERC website, or in the Pacific, in the Flora of the Pacific Northwest, you will find there's more than one common name for most plants. And that's because some people call it a beach carrot and some people call it something else. And they're not scientifically based. But when you're talking to people who are not botanists or taxonomists, they make more sense. So hopefully that answers that. So it's not based on DNA. And somebody asked about rattlesnake plant. That is a composite, like in the daisy family. And it was actually, out of all these plants, it was the one that I had not seen, or at least had not paid attention to when I looked at all the photos. So I was glad to have that one.
Very good. And any lightweight flower ID books for the Olympics?
Yeah. Oh, well, depends on how light you want them, but our chapter actually has 3 brochures that we publish for $3 a piece. One is the plants of the Olympic Mountains, one is plants of the Olympic Coast, and I think the other one's plants of the Olympic Forest. And so anybody that's interested in those, are they on our website, Denise? On our
I don't
store?
believe so, but we could make those available if the chapter would like to.
Yeah, Ann Weinman is the person who kind of takes care of that. But there are other books too that are Olympic mountain plants. I think, in fact, I think David Beek has one. Do you know?
I know
David
of
Beek is the member
David's.
of our chapter.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think he has a Rainier book.
Yeah, he does have a Mount Rainier book, but
Yeah.
and a Mount Hood book. So anyway, if he
Okay.
doesn't, he should have one soon. No, I believe there are several other field guides to Olympic mountains, the Olympic mountains and/or Olympic mountain flora, but I will have to check. So if I can get back to Berna.
Berna Clavinel.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
believe Berna's from our South Sound chapter.
Okay. I'll get back to you on that one, Berna.
And Lydia Stout up here says, thank you for this tremendous opportunity. I've really enjoyed the webinars. Would it be possible to continue doing the webinar format after this crisis is over? I work evenings and cannot attend meetings. And other folks have asked about recordings. And this is webinar number 4 in our series. And yes, we are in process of building our recordings. We have recorded each webinar. We're just working on the storage, on where they're going to live, whether it'll be in YouTube or in a cloud location linked to our website. So please stay tuned for that information. I also wanted to share that tomorrow we have 2 webinars. The first on the Consortium of the Pacific Northwest and other online tutorial data systems with David Giblin, which I believe is at 4:30. And then the Coalition chapter is sharing a presentation, Chasing Blue Carbon, with Katrina Pope, who is a research assistant at Western Washington University. And then on Saturday, we're starting our gardening series. In the morning, we are with Benton Conservation District and the Columbia Basin chapter sharing a new book on heritage garden plants and gardening on the east slope of the Cascades all the way to Spokane. And then also in the afternoon, gardening with natives here in Western Washington. We have 2 new webinars just posted. On Earth Day, we will have Mark Egger presenting Castanea impero with species from all over North America. And on Friday at lunchtime, we will have Donovan Tracy presenting the alpine wildflowers of the Mount Rainier National Park. And then lastly, new webinar to post tonight will be Helen Lau presenting the native plant restorations along the I-90 corridor up in Snoqualmie Pass, where they have built wildlife corridors under and over I-90. So we're excited for all of these great offerings, plus 2 others taking place the last week of the month. And I hope you'll all take the opportunity, and I hope we can continue using this format for some programs because it's turned out to be quite successful. Thank you, Fayla, for sharing this fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thanks.